fortunate to have four esteemed colleagues of mine here for this segment of the Hogan Lovells World Compass presentation. We have Angel Zhang, and I'll let each of them introduce themselves, but quickly we've got Angel Zhang from Sydney, Jesse Shi and Carol Xiao from Beijing, and Ernesto Algaba from Mexico City. I will say each of them have some substantial experience with the regulation of clinical trials in their respective jurisdictions, and that's what we'll be talking about in this segment. So let's start with you, Angel.
Hi, everybody.
Please say a few words about yourself and your practice, and then please briefly describe the clinical trial process for regenerative medicines in Australia.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name's Angel Zhang. I'm a senior associate in the Sydney office. I work with partner Mandy Jacobson, and together we advise a range of clients in the life sciences sector on both the pre-market and post-market process. So in Australia, the clinical trial process for regenerative medicines are twofold. So from the TGA perspective, regenerative medicines, they're generally regulated as biologicals under the Therapeutic Goods Act. And it generally has the same clinical processes as other medicines. But instead of going through the CTN scheme, which is a notification scheme, most of them typically go through the CTA scheme, which is an approval pathway. And what that means is that instead of having your ethics committee review your material, you've also got the TGA looking at all of your efficacy data and safety data as well. So it may lengthen the process for some sponsors. And in addition to that, you also need approval from your general human research ethics committee. And that requires compliance with, good clinical practice and ethical standards in relation to, genomic research and other forms of studies that you may be intending to do.
Great, thank you, Angel. Let's cross the world, go to Mexico City. So Ernesto, if you could say a few words about yourself and your practice, and then please describe the current landscape of clinical trials, clinical studies for regenerative medicines in Mexico. Oh, you're on mute there, Ernesto.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Mike. My name is Ernesto Algaba. I'm a partner of HOGAN LOVELLS based in Mexico City, and I'm the leader for the life science regulatory practice, again, based in Mexico City. So, as part of our day-to-day work in the office, we naturally advise significantly many clients concerning not only clinical trials, but everything that has to do with life science. In terms of what is the landscape of clinical trials for regenerative medicines in Mexico, I think that the current landscape in our country is very attractive. Factors such as diversity that Mexico offers in terms of population and regions, but as well a much lower cost than in other jurisdictions, usually sufficient infrastructure at both public and private hospitals, and experienced professionals make that this landscape is very attractive for investors and for the pharmaceutical companies in our country. Still, regenerative medicine is an emergent field in Mexico. Not as developed as in some other countries, but which makes our government to have a special interest for developing this specific field for promoting health. Moreover, if we consider the variety of complexity of health problems that our country faces. So I can say that there are significant trials currently performed in Mexico dealing with Parkinson's disease, with the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and for bone marrow transplants, and for some other diseases such as the digestive system. So these are, I would say, the main diseases for which trials are being developed at the maximum level of public institutions. Likewise, at the private level, private universities, especially the Technological of Monterrey, is importantly fostering the investigation of regenerative medicines in some other fields, including metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and pulmonary fibrosis. So yes, I think that the current landscape in Mexico offers a lot of opportunities, and it's an attractive destination for the development of clinical trials.
Excellent. Thank you, Ernesto. So now we're going to spin the globe again, and we'll go to China. So Jesse, we'll turn to you. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice, and then please tell us how the Chinese authority governs human genetic resources, or HGRs, in China, and please describe the impact on multinational biopharmaceutical companies when they conduct clinical trials in China on its cell and gene products.
Sure, Michael. Thank you. This is Jessie Xie. I'm from the HOGAN LOVELLS Beijing office. I'm a consul here. And my practice focuses on the life science regulatory, including the clinical trials, product registrations, comply with GMP, GSP, and GCP, as well as I cover some of the commercial contract issues, including the distribution agreement, license agreement, something like that. Well, to answer Michael's questions, as you know, the 21st century is the century of the biology, given the fact that biology plays a key roles in tackling the global challenge, such as the pandemic preventions, treatment of cancers. Also, we see some of the new technologies, including the AI and big data, are being used to driven the biological innovations. So to supervise the biopharmaceutical research, and also to mitigate the risk of constant illegal flow of the Chinese human genetic resources to other countries, the Chinese authority has released 2 laws here in China. The first one is we call the Human Genetic Resource Regulations in 2019, and another one is the biosecurity laws in 2020. The collection, storage, and also the utilization as well as export of the Chinese human genetic resources need to comply with the HGR rules in China. The human genetic resources governed by the HGR rules has actually covered the 2 parts. The first one is the material, such as the tissues, organs, and cells. Another is the human resources information, such as data generated from the using of that materials. So as you can see from the scope, the terms human genetic resources has a wide coverage in China. Also, the biosecurity law is a national law and took effect in 2021. Biosecurity is directly relevant to the food safeties, public health, environment protection, and so forth. The regulations of China's human genetic resources is a very important aspect in that law. And also the biosecurity laws actually echo the requirements in the HGR rules, but impose slightly different legal liabilities for the export of Chinese human genetic resources by the foreign party. Specifically in the context of clinical trials, firstly, under the HGR rules, a foreign party is not allowed to collect, use, or export the human genetic resources in China, but rather it is allowed to do the scientific research together with one or more Chinese parties by way of international cooperative scientific research projects here. Secondly, to carry out that international cooperative research projects, the collaborators need to file for approval from the GRAC offices. But that GRAC approval can be exempted when the scientific research is the clinical trials in China here for the purpose of obtaining the marketing authorizations. But again, they still need to file for what we call the recordation to the HGRAC office by providing the details, for example, the clinical trials and also how the human genetic resource will be used and tested in that clinical trials. That's the general rules in China here.
Great, thank you for that very helpful overview. Great, important for people to know who are interested in clinical trials in China. So now let's move to implications and considerations. So we'll turn back to you, Angel, and if you could tell us what are some of the important considerations when planning for a clinical trial involving regenerative medicines in Australia?
Thanks, Mike. So we've seen a few issues come up recently. The first one is just your general privacy considerations. So often your regenerative medicines, they involve the collection of biological samples from human donors, and that will reveal certain health and genomic information from people, and that's classified as sensitive information, which obviously needs consent before you collect it. We are seeing, I guess, some issues crop up regarding secondary use of information. So at times, you know, some sponsors and manufacturers, they do want to use certain information for future research purpose. So if that's the case, that should be appropriately described in your informed consent forms and receive the appropriate consent in order to do so. And in a similar vein, patient consent is required under the Human Tissues Act of the states and territories as well, in order to collect particular tissue samples from individuals. From a manufacturing perspective, depending on where the manufacturing occurs, often regenerative medicines can involve the collection, and that collection phase is also considered as part of the manufacturing process, which may require licensing and compliance with the therapeutic goods orders and particular standards. And that could include requirements such as donor screening and testing of patients as well for certain diseases prior to collection. And also if manufacturing is occurring overseas, because you know, it may be difficult at times to receive manufacturing authorization in Australia, then you're going to be triggering the import and export laws of human tissue in Australia. And you know, approval needs to be sought from the Therapeutic Goods Administration before seeking to export certain volumes of human fluids or organs or tissues or blood. And you also need approval from the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, which is sort of our, you know, a border force agency. And you need the import permits and declaration as to whether or not particular samples pose a biosecurity hazard.
Excellent. Like the United States, many different agencies with different authorities. It's important to have help navigating all that. So now we'll turn to you, Carol. Thank you also for joining our panel. If you could take a moment to introduce yourself, and then could you elaborate a little bit on the HGR clinical trial recordation process and the associated risks that should be considered?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mike. Hi, everyone. This is Carol. I'm an associate based in HOGAN's Beijing office, and my practice focus on the life science matters, and such as I have assisted the life science clients in providing the regulatory and compliance advice of drugs and medical device on their full life cycles in China, from the preclinical research and clinical trial and the product registration, manufacturing, distribution to the post-marketing studies. And for Mike's questions, for a clinical trial, I think only a record filing formality with the HGRAC in China is required, the so-called Human Genetic Resource Administration of China is required. And in practice, if any sub-party labs are engaged by the foreign sponsor, for example, for the detection analysis and the residue sample disposal, the HGRAC approval requirement will also apply. And regarding the risk, in addition to the regulatory requirement for the clinical trial activity itself, another attention may be called by the cross-border data transfer, which is a common issue for the foreign sponsors in China. Because in the event the foreign sponsor conducts cross-border transfer of the clinical data generated in China from their development activities for the market authorization of the drugs to the specific receiver outside China, such as sending the personal data of the patient to the sponsor's foreign headquarters, and a prior record filing for such cross-border probation from the HGRAC is required. And in our view, there are still risks for the sponsors to conduct such data transfer. This is because such HGR record filing can only be initiated by the Chinese party. However, under the PRC law, including a foreign organization, as well as the entities that are established or actually controlled by a foreign organization or foreign individuals, would be regarded as a foreign party, such as a foreign invested company established in China will be regarded as a foreign party as well, but rather than a Chinese party. Yes. And so in this case, the foreign sponsor will need to obtain the assistance of its Chinese partners and the clinical trial sites, which is a Chinese party according to law, to make the record filing to transfer the HGRAC data out of China. So we think the reliance on an independent Chinese partner, which is not affiliated with the foreign sponsor in the HGRAC, undoubtedly increase the sponsor's risk on such filing, because the foreign sponsor may need to spend extra work of conducting due diligence into the Chinese partners before making the engagement. And if the Chinese partner does not cooperate with the foreign sponsor in the filing, then the foreign sponsor will not be able to complete the cross-border transfer of the HGRAC data. So to sum up, it is critical for the foreign sponsors to take proactive risk management measures to deal with their legal obligations for the HGRAC in China. And we think such as they need to taking over control the whole process of the clinical trial and make sufficient due diligence before selecting the Chinese partners of the clinical trials. Yeah, so that's my thoughts.
Great, thank you. Very, very helpful, important considerations, clearly, for anyone that's going to undertake these endeavors. So we think we've got time for one more round, and we'll just go to sort of other considerations here. Angel, we'll turn back to you. Could you tell us what some of the notable reforms or developments that sponsors should be aware of in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. So the TGA have issued a range of stakeholder feedback and opened up the floor to receive feedback on the regulatory process in terms of clinical pathways. And the feedback from various sponsors was that the approval process is actually quite lengthy, opaque, and some at times confusing. So the TGA currently is trying to see if they can build awareness and education around how the process can be improved. And it's certainly encouraged that sponsors should consult with the TGA early on if you are looking to, initiate a clinical trial in Australia involving regenerative medicines. The TGA and the federal government, they have committed $750 million over the next 10 years, commencing last year, to clinical trial activity involving rare cancers, rare diseases, and any unmet needs in Australia. So that could be of interest to trial sponsors that are looking to expand in this area. The Australian government is also developing a platform called the National One-Stop Shop for Clinical Trials, and that's intended to be a single digital portal for patients and the industry to communicate about clinical trials and somewhat hopefully harmonise the platform for different stakeholders such as the sponsors, HRACs and applicants, so that they can conduct trials activities in one place. So the TGA and the government are aware that this is, an evolving industry, that certain improvements can be made, but you can see that commitments are being put into this area.
Interesting. The figures, the dollar figures you mentioned, is that monies that the government's investing to improve their own processes, or those are potential grant dollars that could be used by sponsors on trials?
Yes, it's a mixture. So there are opportunities to apply for grants, and part of the budget is also used for their own internal procedures to help streamline the process.
Ah, good to know. Good to know. Well, thank you. So Ernesto, we'll turn back to you. And if you could share with us factors that are driving the focus and development of regenerative medicine in Mexico, and something I just learned today regarding therapies, cellular therapies, and the distinction between those and drugs or pharmaceuticals in Mexico.
Yes, gladly, Mike. Yes, we can say that the main factors that are driving and focusing the development of regenerative medicine in Mexico are basically the following. First, we need to differentiate, as you were just mentioning, between different alternatives for the development of the use of regenerative medicines. One could be as a final product, as medicine, or the other one usually can be as a therapy. In terms of the end product or a medicine, it usually will be developed, launched prior to a following or the performing a clinical trial as a final product. Not the specific pathway for the achieving it will be mainly the following up the standard clinical trial process in Mexico, which involves securing an authorization from the Mexican regulator for running the trial, ultimately for securing afterwards a marketing authorization. The process could be lengthy. But anyway, it will be the standard and the natural and the needed process to be followed for the launching of a product or a medicine involving regenerative medicine. The other alternative, I would say, has to do not with the commercialization of an end product or a medicine, but rather the commercialization of a therapy or a treatment. This is basically regulated under Mexican regulations as a donation of tissues or transplants of tissues. So it's completely a different framework for a clinical trial than for the launching and commercialization of a therapy that is not in the form of an end product or medicine. So this has made attractive again Mexican market for the launching of this type of products and therapies, given that there are some alternatives and that there's not only one, but there are some different alternatives that can be adopted and followed for achieving these specific businesses in our country. As well, there are some exemptions for which final products or end products such as medicines could be imported into Mexico without having a marketing authorization. And that will be through the securing a personal use approval from the Mexican regulator. This is, I think, it's a very hot topic in Mexico. It's a trend on how hospitals and the physicians are commercializing and are trying to gain the attention of patients for the using of products that are still not authorized in Mexico. But again, this is still a possibility that is likewise contemplated by the Mexican regulatory framework. That is basically the main difference between the pathways for between a clinical trial and for the development of an end-use product versus to the commercialization of therapies, which will be treated as the transplant of tissues or cells in our country.
So just to clarify, on the second path, the therapies, am I understanding right that a company can't charge for the tissues, the organs, the cells, but they can charge for the services of manufacturing, processing, and supplying those tissues? Is that right?
That is right, Mike. As a general rule, the tissues or cells cannot be a subject of a Business Act or a Commercialization Act, meaning that you cannot charge for a cell or a tissue. Nonetheless, there's a possibility, and that's the way in which the relevant institutions and physicians adopt this, is through charging for the processing, for the service, for the conditioning. I mean, for some other services that are needed for the transplantation of these tissues and cells, rather than for the tissue or cell per se.
And unlike the United States, they could charge a profit on that. Is that right?
Yes, they can charge a profit for the service, but not
For the
for the
service, right, for the service, even if
Yeah.
it's under a clinical trial. Is that, do I understand that right?
Well, under a clinical trial, the general rule is that the study patients or subjects are not allowed to be charged for anything with respect to the clinical trial, meaning that either the sponsors, usually the sponsors, or the institutions are the ones that they undertake those obligations for paying for absolutely everything that has to do with the clinical trial.
Well, thank you. Very interesting and important issues to continue to explore. And we'll turn for the last speaker. Jesse, we'll come back to you to finish it up. And we'll take another interesting issue, which is intellectual property. So if you could tell us what's required under the HGR on allocation of IP ownership concerning scientific research and clinical trials using Chinese human genetic resources.
Sure, Michael. Regarding the IP for the exploratory research, the Chinese authority require both Chinese and foreign parties need to jointly apply for a patent, which means the patent rights must be shared by both parties. As for the other scientific achievement generated from the research, the two parties may agree on how to use, transfer, and share the interests in those scientific achievements through agreements. But for the clinical trials conducted in China for the product marketing authorization purpose, the foreign sponsors can solely own the IP. That's the rules under the HGR.
Got it. Important to know. Well, our time is up, but I hope everyone in the audience found this interesting, and I would encourage you to reach out to any of the speakers here, Ernesto, Carol, Angel, or Jesse, to follow up on these questions and to explore whether Hogan Lovells might be able to assist you in furthering your mission and addressing and anticipating some of these questions.